It was interesting listening to Inga this morning, Inga just now talking about, or the whole conversation about going beyond measuring GDP. But I think we need to go beyond going beyond measuring GDP. And I know that's a bit of complicated English, but what I mean is that we need to go beyond going beyond measuring GDP because we need to integrate these into decision-making processes. And at many levels, we need to integrate these kinds of measures into decision-making at international levels, at multilateral levels, at country levels. So, having said that, I'm from the Global Environment Facility. We're the financial mechanism to 5 international conventions, one of which is the Convention on Biological Diversity, which is why we're all here. We provide grant funding to maybe approximately 160 developing countries to help them meet the objectives of these conventions. We operate in 4-year funding cycles. We recently completed our replenishment for our 8th cycle, and so we've started our, what we call our GEF 8 on the 1st of July, and that will run for 4 years. Now, why am I giving you this history? Because in this process, our replenishment negotiations for this cycle, which has taken place over the last year and a half, we started the conversation on going beyond GDP in terms of how we allocate resources to countries. So we have 5 focal areas: biodiversity, climate change, land degradation, international waters, and chemicals and waste. And for 3 of those 5 focal areas, in fact, for the 3 areas that are related to the Rio Conventions, we have what we call, we have an allocation system where we pre-allocate grant funding to our recipient countries. And since the beginning of time, or since the allocation system was first introduced in 2006, and then amended in 2010, GDP has been one of the parameters in that system. So what that allocation system looks at, it looks at the potential for a country to contribute to global environmental benefits. It looks at the capacity of the country to generate those benefits. And then we have an income-based measure to marginally shift resources between richer and poorer countries. And forever, that has been GDP. Now, for our GEF 8, every cycle we revisit this allocation system, and we look at new data sets, new ways of measuring, new methodologies. And for the first time in these negotiations in the last year and a half, we started a conversation about using something other than GDP. Now, we have a series of multilateral institutions that include income-based measures in their own allocation systems. And generally, this is GDP or GNI. So I would think that what we've gone through in the last little while has been sort of pioneering the discussion and taking it to another level. Now, having said that, we have stuck with GDP for our GEF 8 cycle as a measure, but we started the conversation. We started looking at different ways of measuring, recognizing that the limitations, the benefits of GDP, and in fact, recognizing the benefits of GDP made us keep it, but also recognizing its limitations. And as a result, for our next cycle, which we will start negotiations for in about 3 years, we've now been mandated by our governing body to look further into these issues with an eye to introducing a different measure in GEF 9. So maybe it's a little bit of a longer conversation than a shorter one, as these things tend to be, but I think we've taken a really, really important step. So the 2 steps I outlined, one in terms of integrating beyond GDP measures into multilateral decision-making, we've taken that first step. We're on that journey. And it has been a very interesting conversation, a very rich conversation, sometimes tense conversation as well, because of course, you know, we're not a development fund, we're an environmental fund. And so that's point 1. And point 2, of course, is that once you look at any aggregate measure at a country level, you're then taking away from the sub-national differences that can exist. And this is the case for GDP, for inclusive wealth, for any aggregate level, which, you know, when you start looking at different levels within a country, the situation can be very different from one area to the next. And that's an ongoing challenge for all of us in terms of how we, you know, how we measure and what the kinds of data that we input into these kinds of processes. So the first point in terms of multilateral decision-making, I'd like to think we've taken the first step. We've now started the conversation with the other institutions that have performance-based allocation systems as well. They've all witnessed our own, the conversations we've had with our donors and our recipient countries on this in the last year and a half. And I'm hopeful that, this conversation will continue to be enriched, and also enriched by data sets such as the Inclusive Wealth report, as well as many others that are coming up into this space. Now, the second point in terms of how can we integrate this into country decision-making? Well, the GEF is also working in that area through an increasing focus on what we call policy coherence, which can be called many different things. And in fact, I've heard it a lot here as the whole of government approach. More and more international conversations, we're hearing this kind of terminology that all means the same thing, which means that people can't be contradicting each other in terms of the decisions that are taken at national levels. I'm from the Caribbean, and sometimes we say that the left hand doesn't know what the right hand is doing. And this is the definition of policy incoherence. And believe me, it's not only a national challenge. We even have it in our own institutions. Yeah, at the GEF, at the World Bank, at UNEP, sometimes we don't know what we're doing, or we may be doing things that contradict each other, especially when there's a huge portfolio and a large disparity. So at the GEF, policy coherence is a concept that is now cross-cutting, and that we have integrated very strongly into our GEF 8 programming strategy. And we're also looking at incorporating it more strongly into our active portfolio. So this is something, at a grander level than inclusive wealth, at a grander level than going beyond GDP, but this is one of the concepts that's very close to that. We're starting to integrate these ideas and these frameworks into how we fund projects, how the projects are designed, and how the project benefits can be sustained beyond the project lifetime.